Hi class, welcome to lesson number 24. We're continuing this topic of market structure. We talked about perfect competition in a lot of detail. We took a couple lessons to explain that out, but hopefully, at this point you have a good idea about perfect competition. With that being said, I do want to recap perfect competition real quick. The answer to the homework question last time I asked was, draw me a scenario where, the short run, long run difference, where in the short run you have profits and what happens in the long run. For those of you who remember, for perfect competition, really there are no profits in the long run. So the way you adjust it if you have a profit or a gain in the short run is you have to adjust the supply curve because based on enter or exit, if there are profits in the short run, in a perfect competition market, what happens is people enter the market, right? Because they want to make money, right? So they enter the market, and because what they do when they enter it, they start to create more product. Supply shifts to the right here. Supply shifts to the right. What that does, it creates a new price that's lower, and that translates to the firm, and that destroys the profits, right? Same with losses. If there's losses involved, what tends to happen is people leave the market, supply shifts left, price goes up, right? Same here, price goes up, and the losses go away. So moral of the lesson is in the long run, really, the firm does not have profits or losses. It has normal profit or zero profit. So the homework question was to draw a scenario where in the short run you have a profit, kind of like this one over here, where the price is lower than your ATC. And then what happens is that because there's profits, what happens in the long run? Well, people come in, supply shifts to the right, and because of that lower price, you eliminate the profit, and price should equal ATC. So your costs are equivalent to your price, profits run away. Quantity decreases for the firm, but quantity increases for the market. How does that happen? Well, because there's less competition, there's less people. The firms will be less efficient because they have less incentive to be more efficient, right? So they produce less because they're not making as much money, but the market produces more because there are more people, right? This is after a profit. If you have a loss, then what will happen is the prices will go up, right? And in that case, the quantity will actually shift to the left. So this is a big difference. Perfect competition, remember this, it's really important. I think the biggest, understanding you have to have is between the long run and short run. Long run, remember, no profits. There's zero profits. Why would someone have zero profits? First of all, remember that perfect competition is kind of like this perfect case scenario, and it's pretty difficult to achieve perfect competition in today's world. But some agricultural commodities, are pretty similar. But the point is that you have to remember that when we say normal profits in economics, when we say profits are zero, it's not like accounting profit, right? In accounting, we say, hey, it's zero profit, meaning your explicit costs are factored for, but they don't account for implicit costs. So when I tell you in economics that these guys in the long run have zero profits, I mean to say that they can take their money anywhere else and they still are not able to get a rate of return that's bigger or higher, right? Because if that's true, then you won't have zero as your normal profit. I hope that makes sense to you. So in economics, when we say our profit's zero, we've accounted for any other opportunities you could possibly be part of that could make you money. Really speaking, so this is like best case scenario. So in the long run, perfect competition, the way it works. Long run, there's no profits or losses. With that being said, I think we can move on to the new topic for the day, and it's monopoly. Monopoly is quite interesting because it's exactly the opposite of a perfect competition, right? I mean, if you think about a monopoly, if you talk about perfect competition, right? The four characteristics we talked about for perfect competition, we said one of them were many independent small firms, right? Think of monopoly, the way it works is there's just one firm, right? And by definition, that's how it works. Sometimes we think monopoly, we associate with a lot of companies and whatnot. The thing is that when it comes to reality, especially in a country like the United States, there's a lot of regulation that helps prevent monopolies being created because it's technically not fair to other companies. But the point is there are some companies that come close to it. You've heard of De Beers having a control on the diamond business. They have a monopoly. And we can explain to you why you can think of a monopoly and how you kind of characterize and classify a monopoly. So similar to perfect competition, there are four characteristics that describe a monopoly. And we'll go over all four right now. So let me take this time to erase the board. and write down the 4 characteristics that are pretty important for a monopoly. Okay, so with that in mind, you can think of a lot of times, a lot of examples of monopolies in your head. Sometimes power companies, natural resources, oil companies, right? If you're talking about resources and things like that. Sometimes it could be like even a company that has a patent on a drug or something that can just, dominate the market because they have the scientific advantage and also the legal documentation like a patent to protect themselves. But we'll talk about all that when it comes to monopoly and what makes a monopoly a monopoly. So this for now goes away and we're talking now about monopoly. All right. So in terms of, I think, the lengthwise, I think perfect competition we go over a lot in detail because it's really, really important for microeconomics. Monopoly, we're not going to cover as much detail as perfect competition. But that being said, we do have to cover it because it's really important too. So let's start off with this. So obviously we're talking about monopoly. For those of you who like the game, it's an absolutely great game. Might teach you something about economics, but for the most part, we have to go by the textbook definitions. Monopoly can be characterized by 4 characteristics, okay? So a firm is a monopoly if, number 1, it's a single producer. Single producer. What do we mean by single producer? Well, the thing is that, have you ever walked into a town where there's only one bank or one gas station? They could charge you whatever they want, right? Because if you want gas, that's the only company to go to, right? If you listen to the radio, a particular channel has only one station, right? It's not like you can turn to 99.9 and you have like 2 different stations, right? There's only one station. So that's basically what they're saying is that in a limited set of data points, right? You can say like in the United States or in the world or whatever, this firm is only the single producer. They're the only producer of this product, okay? No one else makes it. This is a strict definition of a monopoly. Some companies or some firms in reality can look like a monopoly, but our textbook definition says they're not if they're not the single producer, right? So there is no competition in a pure monopoly, okay? Let's see. Let's talk about the second one because I think the first one is pretty straightforward. Single producer, no one else. All right, the second one is no close substitutes. Kind of like the first one. No close substitutes. All right, kind of like the first one, right? I mean, it kind of says that, well, if there's a single producer of the product, how can there's no competition, therefore there's no substitutes. But the point is that, it could be not even in the same market, right? But if it's a substitute product, that cannot be a monopoly. For instance, if you consider, some people consider hot dogs and hamburgers in their examples of substitute goods, right? That cannot be possible. For that particular product, there cannot be substitute products, okay? So it basically says the utility that you get from this particular product, okay, it cannot match other products, okay? So, you could have different examples or whatnot, but for a diamond, if you take a diamond, right, I mean, there are other stones that can be compared to it. Typically speaking, though, kind of diamonds is kind of by standing alone itself, right? If you want to propose to your wife, you're not going to be like, take this pebble, right? It's not a substitute. A diamond is, a diamond. There's no other substitute products for it. There are other stones, don't get me wrong. But the point is, in its class or in its whatever you can compare it to, there's no close substitutes. Okay? So that's the second one. Again, I think pretty straightforward. Third are barriers to entry. Okay, this is really important. And I'll tell you why. Okay, barriers to entry are important because if you did not have barriers to entry, okay, you would not have a monopoly. Why? Okay, so say, let's pick on De Beers today. Like, for instance, say that anyone could get in the diamond business. They can make diamonds. then De Beers would not be a monopoly, right? Because one, they would have other competition. They would not be the single producer. They would have other people who are producing the same product. So barriers to entry are significant, okay? They're significant in a monopoly, right? In a market that has a monopoly, the barriers to entry are significant because they will not let other people come into this market, because otherwise they would not be a monopoly, right? And they cannot charge whatever they want, okay? So barriers to entry are extremely important. So this basically says that, one, there's no competition, right, for the monopoly, and two, there's no other choice for the consumer. Okay, so if you want to buy a diamond, chances are it's coming from the De Beers family. Okay, again, that's the closest example we have. But in a pure monopoly, you would not have a choice as a consumer. You just have to buy it from them. Okay, so they have absolute control of the market. So these three things together form the fourth one. Okay, and the fourth characteristic of a monopoly is called market power. And we've kind of discussed about this. Market power basically states that you have the ability to dictate prices, okay? You have the ability to dictate prices. Remember, in a perfect competition, we had so many different firms, and none of them had power, right? None of them had power. They could not dictate the price. It was the equilibrium, right? The demand and supply that created the equilibrium that created the price. In these cases, in a monopoly case, it's different. Because they have no competition, there's a single producer, their product cannot be, there's no close substitutes to it, right? They absolutely can dictate what people pay for it, right? So this gives them market power, right? So the price setting ability is what makes their market power unique, right? So for a monopoly, right, all these four, according to me, are pretty straightforward, right? I mean, you're thinking monopoly, you're thinking probably they're a single producer, right? Obviously, if they're a single producer, there's no close substitutes to the products. Barriers to entry have to be significant, otherwise it won't be a monopoly in the first place. And fourthly, they have market power, because if they're having all these characteristics, they have to dominate the market and set the price, right? So they set the price. Now, out of all of these, I said that barriers to entry is the most important, because that's what makes a monopoly a monopoly. So let's take time to explain these barriers of entry. So on this side, I'm going to have a new section, right? And I'm going to title it Barriers to Entry and discuss the different barriers to entry that exist for a monopoly, okay? So barriers, there's an E in here, to entry. Okay, so what are these barriers to entry? Okay, they can exist in many ways. What I'm giving you are just examples. There are other barriers to entry, definitely, but these are just some examples so you know and you have an idea of what we're talking about. The first one are legal barriers, okay? For those of you who know Nike shoes, right? All Nike shoes come with this kind of a check sign, right? The Nike swoosh, right? And it kind of below it says, "Just do it," okay? Their commercials and whatnot. Nike always has this tagline, "Just do it." Visa or MasterCard, right? They have their own commercials that are different. Point is that Nike can do this whole "Just do it" campaign with this Nike swoosh, right? Because there's a thing that are different things that protect this thing, okay? So one is called trademarks, okay? Trademarks, right? Trademarks are legal, they offer legal protection to companies. So to Nike, when they have a trademark on the sign, they basically says that it is illegal to copy this symbol, right? So if all other shoes started to have like these, if there were no trademarks, all their shoes would kind of have these Nike swoosh signs, right? And they would have their commercial saying, "Just do it." And all of a sudden, you would not have barriers to entry, right? People would just come in and they would give Nike a run for their money. But that's not what happens. What happens in real life is that there's protection that's being offered in the form of trademarks. Other forms include copyright, okay? Copyrights are also important for written information. There's patents, okay? You've heard of many drugs like Lipitor, Viagra, whatever it is. The point is that these drugs exist because there's particular patents that protect these drugs for over 20 years, okay? So, if a drug is protected for over 20 years, you cannot copy that particular drug, okay? So that medicine works, for 20 years and you cannot copy them, right? So they absolutely have control, right? If you have a particular condition and these are the only people that have the medicine, you have to buy it from them, okay? And patents offer legal protection for this scientific research, okay? So legal barriers are what prevent it. Now, it's not what makes a monopoly, okay? Because that would be, that would kind of contradict it. A government would not create something that creates a monopoly, okay? But understand that legal barriers are important in creating barriers to entry. Okay, with that being said, let's go over number 2. What's the second barrier to entry? The second example is economies of scale. We see that word again, don't we? Economies. Let me go ahead and erase this part. So economies of scale, we talked about this before in a couple classes ago. And the concept was that these are the advantages that producers have when they expand, right? I hope everybody remembers that. Economies of scale, right? If you remember it, we had this whole long run average cost curve that kind of looked like a giant parabola. And this part of the cost curve was called economies of scale because what happens is as the producer produces more, right? There's more quantity being produced. He faces lower costs. He or she faces lower costs. So profits increase, right? And we talked about different reasons. They said, well, there could be specialization. There could be the fact that people are getting efficient at building their goods, at controlling their costs. Whatever it is, the point is that a firm, as it gets bigger, right? Economies of scale states that they have lower costs. So this gives an edge, right? To large companies, right? So if you want to talk about large companies versus small companies, right? If you want to talk about, we talked about previously, we talked about patent, we said, drug companies, if you take a company like Pfizer versus, which is a large pharmaceutical company, versus a company that is kind of, small, it's kind of up and going, just started out, from one of the countries in India, China, it could be anywhere, right? Now, imagine they have to do R&D, right? Research and development to find a new drug. Pfizer, first of all, knows exactly what's the formula of what's the process of going through an entire research and drug, process to get a drug out, right? So they're big. They have these economies of scale. They're efficient at making their goods, right? So they have the ability, right, to control these costs, okay? Because they know everything going in, how much it's going to cost, right? So the smaller company, it's harder for them because they have to face this part of the cost curve, and they're not there yet, right? If you talk about, making these pills, right? Pfizer probably has factories that make it already, so adding one more is not going to make a big difference. But for a company that does not have a factory or the people or the manpower, costs are going to be huge in terms of building that pill, okay? So, economies of scale is a very good reason why barriers to entry are created in markets and why monopolies are created, okay? So that's the second one. I think one of the other things we want to talk about economies of scale is that there's an extreme example where the economies of scale is so high, right? What we mean by that is the extent of this curve is so long, okay, that some firm is sitting over here, okay, and has the ability to absolutely dominate because everybody else has an extremely high cost, right? So if the economies of scale kind of looks like that, someone who sits about here, right, have the ability to dominate the rest of the market because everybody else faces an extremely high cost. That is called a natural monopoly, okay? A natural monopoly is a monopoly that has a severe case of economies of scale, right? Where the cost curve for the rest of the firms are so high that they cannot even manage. And this firm has the ability to provide the supply for the entire demand for the entire market. An example would be, quite frankly, people talk about power companies. They say that power companies, because if you want to start a grid in your country, good luck, right? It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort. But the current company that already has those grids, they're just sitting there, right? And they don't have too much building to do, right? Their costs are quite low. All they have to do is generate power, right? So it's an absolutely beautiful business. So they're called a natural monopoly, okay? Because it's so severe to get into that that particular market because the costs are so high up front. Okay? So that's a case of severe economies of scale. That's called a natural monopoly. All right, the third one is called, it's about resources, okay? And this is going to be who has control over resources, okay? So the third barrier to entry is resources. And I'll tell you why it's important. Okay, so resources. Imagine that you are part of the De Beers family. Okay, lucky you, right? Because what you have, your company, right, has the control of your family, has control over areas, right, that are extremely high in diamond deposits. Okay, so if you control, and I want to get into your land, and I'm gonna say, actually, you know what? I want to buy this land from you. You're gonna say no. Because you have control over this land that has its resources. I'll give you an example. Say that all the bottled water in this world, okay, is produced by one person. Okay? Obviously, this is an example, right? Won't happen. But this is an example. All the bottled water in this world is controlled by one person. You have the ability, okay, to dictate whatever price you want because one, you are the single producer, okay? 2, no close substitutes to water, okay? 3, barriers to entry are extremely high because you get to control them, right? Maybe you have, control over resources like water. Maybe the fresh water in the world belongs to you, and no one else has the ability to tap into the fresh water, right? Imagine the kind of money you can make, okay? I'm kidding, don't do that. That's not possible. Anyways, point is the resources, who controls the resources? So the question is, who controls resources, right? So oftentimes when you talk about natural resources, you talk about oil, you talk about, it could be any food, anything like that. If you have control, right, who controls resources? They have the power, right? And most of the times, monopolies have control. Actually, all the time, if you have a monopoly, they control their resources, right? And they will make sure that no one else can get a hold of these resources. Because that's what makes them special and unique, and that's what makes them a single producer. Because once you get those resources, right? If you get those resources, they're not a monopoly anymore, okay? You start producing the stuff, maybe even for cheaper, and they're gone, right? So they're going to do their best in protecting the resources they control, right? Which is, if they're a monopoly, they control everything, okay? Or the majority of it. So resources are extremely important, and they're found in natural resources to be, where monopolies exist. Okay, so the last one we wanted to go over, actually those would be pretty much all the barriers to entry. But the ones you need to start thinking about, is what makes a monopoly, so unique, and what can, keep them from, kind of falling apart. And the key lies in the barriers to entry. Okay? Because of the barriers to entry, everything kind of falls in place. All right? So maybe you have an edge, whatever it is, you need to have some sort of a obstacle for other people to enter your market, because that will ensure that you can control and dominate the market. That being said, these are the 4 things that you need to keep in mind for a monopoly. In the next lesson, we're going to go over, the second half of monopoly, which is, talks about monopoly and demand, and, just graphing how monopolies dictate their price. You still need to remember that golden rule where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's really important. So in kind of, doing a recap of all of the different things that we've gone over today, monopoly is really important because of its unique characteristics, okay? You have perfect competition on one end and monopoly on the other. We said in perfect competition, we said that price is being dictated by the market. Here, monopoly dictates the market because they have market power, right? They are the single producer, while in perfect competition, right, you have many producers and they're small. This is one large producer. In perfect competition, there are no barriers to entry. Remember? It's very easy to exit and enter the market. In this one, it has huge and significant barriers to entry because in a monopoly, that's what makes that firm unique, right? There are no close substitutes. In perfect competition, the exact opposite, okay? There are hundreds and hundreds of substitutes for any product in a perfect competition, right? So, if when you think and compare these two kind of market structures, they're exactly on the opposite end of each other, okay? And that's what is really important differentiating them, and I hope all of you can go over that. The next part, we're going to go over the graphs and the lessons to just talk about how visually we can describe a monopoly, how they set their price, how you show a profit, right? It's a little more specialized than a perfect competition graph, but to a certain degree, I'm sure that all of you will able to follow the monopoly concept. So in the next lesson, we're going to finish up monopoly. The one last thing I want to cover before I leave you guys is talking about how monopolies kind of set their particular price, right? I want you all to not forget the whole concept of marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because no matter what market structure you're in, that's how you profit maximize, okay? So remember that. But again, the one last note I want to talk about is just the elasticity of demand, okay? The elasticity of demand. Monopolies, the one last thing I want to leave you guys is monopolies, right, do not have a perfectly elastic demand. They don't, right? Because they're not in perfect competition. Rather, they have a downward sloping demand graph, okay? And I don't know if you remember, but in one of the classes before, I said your demand can be split into 3 areas. There's a midpoint, okay? Midpoint, we're talking about elasticity, it's perfectly elastic. E is equal to 1, okay? Here, this area right here, this region is elastic, okay? This is unit elastic here. And this is inelastic. This region right here is inelastic. Okay? The one thing I want to leave you guys is with the fact that monopolies like to operate in the elastic region. Okay? And I'll tell you why in the next class. So join me in the next class. Before I let you guys go, your homework question probably shouldn't be a surprise. Tell me the 4 characteristics that differentiate a monopoly. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you guys in the next lesson and finish up monopoly.